Welcome, class, to the Week 9 presentation for ME150. We are in the final weeks of our class, so please be sure to read the announcements and check your email for upcoming due dates. Especially Week 10, it's a little bit different than most of our weeks. Our class ends on a Thursday, not a Sunday, so I always like to be sure to advertise that to you all so you can plan accordingly. So just keep that in mind and make sure you watch for those emails and announcements in the classroom as well. Let's dive right in. Today we have two chapters to focus on. They do kind of go hand in hand. A lot of chapter 11 talks about the beginning of life and childhood, also a lot about genetics. And then chapter 12 goes through death and dying, so it's kind of like the full circle of life is covered. Make sure you do read those two chapters. We are going to cover the content that's going to give you the biggest bang for your buck in terms of your quiz. So there are some things in the chapters that we will not cover that are as important, so you do want to make sure you read through everything that's in those chapters. We're going to start by focusing on genetics and heredity, and just start with definitions. I will tell you the definition of genetics is important for your quiz. What genetics is, it's a science that accounts for natural differences and resemblances among organisms related by descent. So an example, children in the family all have blue eyes. The biological parents also have blue eyes. The science that explains these similarities is genetics. Heredity, this is the science of or the process by which organisms pass genetic traits on to their offspring. So you can see there's a little bit of difference. They are closely related in terms of definition, but there is a distinction between the two. Next, we're going to talk about gene and genome. So a gene is a tiny segment of DNA found on a chromosome within a cell's nucleus. So genes are carried by chromosomes and are responsible for all human characteristics, everything from eye, skin, hair color, to even height, body type, and intelligence. Genome, what that term means, it's all the DNA in an organism, including its genes. So it's just a larger scale. Moving on to something I think is pretty darn cool. It's the Human Genome Project. Hopefully you've heard of it. It was a scientific project funded by the United States government way back in 1990, and it was completed in the year 2000. The purpose was to map all of the human's genes, and there are 46 genes that they mapped. The reason why that's important is then we can start to identify where certain diseases can stem from and how to correct the gene if it does have an abnormality or a mutation. There are lots of different reasons why genetic testing is currently used. This isn't something your quiz focuses on necessarily, except for forensic testing, and I'll talk about that in a second. But I think it's important to look at all the different ways genetic testing is used. It's kind of interesting. I find it pretty fascinating. I do want to focus for a second on forensic testing. So the medical examiner is attempting to eliminate a suspect in a crime. That medical examiner might use forensic DNA testing in that situation. So that's important to know what forensic testing is for your quiz. Also, another reason why genes are so important is there's genetic diseases. So a permanent change in DNA is usually a cause for genetic disease. And it's that permanent change in the DNA is called a mutation, and that word is important for your quiz. This list is not something you have to memorize, and I know it's quite small, but it does come from your textbook, so you can always refer to it in there. The one disease I want to point out is Alzheimer's disease. And stem cells that develop into neuronal tissues can be used to treat patients with Alzheimer's. So it's important to know that we're getting to those advances based on genetic testing on how to treat some of these genetic diseases. That is important for your quiz, that the stem cells that develop into neuronal tissues can be used to treat patients with Alzheimer's. Again, don't take the time to memorize all the genetic diseases. It's something I do want you to look over and, make note of, but it's not something that's going to be on your quiz. Genetic discrimination. So obviously with all this genetic information out there, we can now, understand the different genes that are within the body. We can test for certain things. Obviously, once we have this information, it can be used for good or bad. And it developed into where the government was worried that there would be some sort of discrimination. So what that means is differential treatment based on actual or presumed genetic differences. So we want to safeguard people against that. There are laws that do prohibit genetic discrimination. It's partially due to a study done by Harvard Med School's Lisa Geller. There are now these laws in place to prevent genetic discrimination. The one that we are most focused on for your quiz is GINA, and that means Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. What I want you to know is what it does. So in 2008, GINA was passed to prohibit discrimination in employment based on genetic information. So it helps prevent discrimination in employment based on genetic information. HIPAA you're probably already familiar with. We've talked about that. ADA, I think we've talked about that one as well, Americans with Disabilities Act. ACA is the Affordable Care Act. So all of these are hopefully familiar to you at this point. Next, let's touch on genetic engineering. What that means is it's a manipulation of DNA within the cells of plants, animals, or even other organisms. And it's done via synthesis, alteration, or repair to ensure that certain harmful traits will be eliminated in offspring and that desirable traits will appear and be passed on. It sounds good, but there is a lot of controversy with it due to unforeseen effects. So when we get into thinking, oh, we could eliminate certain traits, well, who's to decide which traits we want to eliminate? Who's in control of that? So you can see where that could create a little controversy. Next, we'll touch on cloning. Cloning is the process by which organisms are created asexually, usually from a single cell of a parent organism, and it is quite controversial. An example where cloning is used, farm animals are sometimes cloned to produce medically useful substances. Xenotransplantation. It's a big long word. It's the transplantation of animal tissues and organs into humans. There are certain compatibilities that make it possible, and there's also some controversy surrounding that process as well. So some of the objections to genetic engineering, let's go through these. This is just for your knowledge. It's not necessarily something that's going to be asked on the quiz. I just thought it was interesting and wanted to include it for you. Cloning does not always yield a viable offspring. So these are all the objections to genetic engineering. 30% of live clones are affected with large offspring syndrome and other debilitating conditions. So sometimes things don't end up as an exact replica. A large failure rate in human clones is unacceptable. Many clones die prematurely. Scientists do not know how cloning affects mental development. And a lot of people have the mindset that it's unethical to use animals in this manner. Gene therapy, so let's touch on this. This is treating harmful genetic diseases or traits by eliminating or modifying the harmful gene. And we talked about a little bit with Alzheimer's, how they're coming up with ways to treat that. There's a variety of applications. The one I want you to focus on is somatic gene therapy. It can be used for patients with severe genetic disorders, and it involves inserting normal copies of the gene. So that's the one I want you to know. Somatic gene therapy involves inserting normal copies of the gene. Next, we're going to talk about infertility. By definition, it means the failure to conceive for a period of 12 months or longer due to a deviation from or an interruption of normal structure or function of any part of the reproductive part, organ, or system. So there are options out there for couples that struggle with infertility. Here are some listed. In vitro fertilization. This is where fertilization takes place outside the woman's body in a test tube. So a fertilization specialist brings an infertile couple's eggs and sperm together in a test tube. And when fertilization occurs, They then transport the resulting embryo back into the female's uterus. Artificial insemination and surrogacy. The one that's not listed on here that your quiz also asks about is adoption. So any adult who shows the desire to be a fit parent may adopt a child. The one type of adoption your quiz tends to focus on is agency adoption. So this is a type of adoption generally involving placing children who have been orphaned or whose parents have been lost or relinquished parental rights through abuse, abandonment, or the inability to support them. And again, that's agency adoption. Children have rights, and there are laws that regulate that. The one in red is the one I want you to focus on, parens patriae. And that's a legal doctrine that gives the state the authority to act in the child's best interest. So it's that concept of if something bad is going on, the state can step in based on the child's best interest. So an example, a state agency removes a 10-year-old child from the home of parents who abuse him. The legal doctrine that allows the state to act in the best interest of the child is pars patriae. So do remember that term for your quiz. Next, we're starting to get into our next chapter. So you'll notice we're switching more to death and dying at this point. Brain injury can be caused by a number of different ways, but oftentimes the result is coma or persistent vegetative state. So a coma is referred to as a deep stupor from which the patient cannot be aroused by external stimuli. The persistent vegetative state is different. This is a severe mental impairment with irreversible cessation of higher functions of the brain, which is most often caused by damage to the cerebral cortex. And I want you to remember that the damage for PVS, or persistent vegetative state, happens more than likely in the cerebral cortex. When we're talking about death, oftentimes people will have an autopsy done. So it's a postmortem or after death examination that helps determine the cause of death and or obtains physiologic evidence when necessary. So sometimes we know how they died, but we need to get more evidence as to the specifics, or sometimes we don't know how someone died and we need to find out. Autopsies are performed in hospitals and may confirm or correct clinical diagnoses. They're also performed, and I want you to remember this for your quiz, in cases in which a death is suspicious or due to homicide. So if we know someone did not die on their own accord, but was killed in some manner, and we have to find out how they were killed, and that's where an autopsy would also come in handy. Talking about the process of dying, oftentimes patients get to a point where their disease is going to be fatal. We know that they're on their last moments of life or last days or months of life, and the doctor may order hospice care. So hospice is designed to treat or target hospice is not designed to treat or target the underlying disease. So in hospice care, it's more to keep them comfortable during their final moments. It's not to treat what's causing death to occur. There is a multidisciplinary team of caregivers that step in, including doctors, nurses, home health aides, social workers, physical therapists, among many others. There's usually facilities for hospice. It can occur in the patient's home or a nursing home, and again, they have hospice houses now. Another issue that comes up when we're thinking of death and dying is euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. There are actually 4 different types. Your book goes through all 4 quite nicely. The one I want to focus on for your quiz is passive euthanasia. An example of passive euthanasia is a patient asks a doctor, "Can you help me die in peace?" The doctor agrees to withhold medical treatment for the patient. That would be an example of passive euthanasia. Coincidentally, your quiz also focuses on wakes. which is a type of way to honor the dead. That originates from an ancient custom, and the ancient custom involved keeping watch over the deceased, hoping life would return. The next part on the Patient Self-Determination Act, this is not covered on your quiz. However, I find it very important to cover, so I wanted to make sure to go through this. PSDA, or Patient Self-Determination Act of 1990, requires providers to ask patients if they have advanced directives. Advanced directives could be one of four things. It can be a living will. A living will is an advanced directive that specifies an individual's end-of-life wishes. It could be durable power of attorney, and that's an advanced directive that confers upon a designated authority to make a variety of legal decisions on behalf of the person, and it's usually involving the healthcare decisions. They may have a healthcare proxy, and that's a durable power of attorney issued for purposes of healthcare decisions only. So they don't have any other legal rights other than the healthcare decisions. A do not resuscitate order, or a DNR. That's when admitted to a hospital, most patients are allowed to state whether they want to be revived if their heart stops. So all of those are different types of advanced directives, and the patients have those rights based on that Patient Self-Determination Act of 1990. We are at the point where it's your turn for any questions or clarifications or concerns. So if you do have something spinning in your head that's not making much sense, or you need additional help, definitely seek me out, as I'm always here to help you. My door is always open. You have my email address. That's the quickest way to get a hold of me, so definitely, if need be, use it. Don't forget, all of your assignments this week are due by Sunday. Of course, look over the upcoming due dates so that you know and understand when everything is due. And as always, our information presented today did come from your textbook. Thank you so much for your time today, and have a great week.